Welcome to EduCasts, home of EduCasters. One of the coolest contributions of Gestalt psychology to education is the concept of insight learning. This was famously studied by Wolfgang Kohler with his chimpanzees on the island of Tenerife. The most famous chimp, Sultan, was put in a cage with a banana just out of reach outside the bars. Sultan had 2 sticks, but neither was long enough to reach the banana. A behaviorist would expect Sultan to just try random things, throw the stick, bite the cage, scream, until he accidentally hit on the solution. Trial and error. But that's not what happened. Sultan tried a few things, failed, and then he sat down. He looked at the sticks. He looked at the banana. He paused. Then, suddenly, he grabbed the 2 sticks, fitted them together to make one long stick, and raked in the banana. That pause? That was the cognitive processing. Sultan was rearranging the elements of his field until he saw a new relationship. He didn't just stumble onto the answer. He understood the structure of the problem. That is insight. Productive versus reproductive thinking. Max Wertheimer distinguished between reproductive thinking and productive thinking. Reproductive thinking is just repeating what you have been taught. It is rote memorization. It is plugging numbers into a formula without knowing what the formula does. It is useful for simple tasks, but it falls apart when the problem changes slightly. Productive thinking is insight-based. It involves understanding the underlying structure of the problem. In the classroom, we want to foster productive thinking. Let's look at a math example. You can teach a kid the formula for the area of a rectangle, length times width, and the area of a parallelogram, base times height. They can reproduce that. But if you use a Gestalt approach, you might give them a paper parallelogram and a pair of scissors and say, turn this into a rectangle. The student looks at it. They cut off the triangle from one side, move it to the other side, and boom, it's a rectangle. Now they realize, oh, the area of a parallelogram is the same as a rectangle because it is a rectangle, just shifted. That is productive thinking. They didn't just memorize the formula, they derived it. They saw the whole, and because they had that insight, they will never forget it. How do we encourage this? We have to stop being answer dispensers. We need to be facilitators of problems. We need to create environments where the solution is reachable, but the student has to make the mental leap themselves. We need to value the process of figuring it out, not just the correctness of the final answer. Gestalt theory isn't just about how we see lines and shapes. It's about how we exist in an environment. Kurt Lewin, a psychologist heavily influenced by Gestalt ideas, introduced the concept of field theory. He said that behavior is a function of the person and their environment. He called this the life space. Every student walks into your classroom with a specific life space. This includes their internal state. Are they hungry, tired, anxious? And their external environment. Is the room cold? Is the kid next to them being a jerk? The whole of the learning experience includes these emotional and environmental factors. You cannot teach the part, the algebra lesson, if the whole, the student's well-being, is out of whack. This ties into what we now call social-emotional learning, SEL. Gestalt theory supports the idea that the classroom needs to be a safe, supportive field. If the atmosphere is threatening, the student's perceptual field narrows. They go into survival mode. They can't see the big picture. They can only focus on the threat, the scary teacher, the bully. To foster insight and holistic learning, the teacher has to curate the emotional vibe of the room. It needs to be a place where it is safe to make mistakes. Remember, insight often comes after a period of frustration or confusion, just like Sultan sitting in the cage. If students are terrified of being wrong, they won't take the mental risks necessary for insight. They will stick to safe, reproductive thinking. So how does this look when we zoom out to the level of curriculum design? If we believe that the whole comes before the parts, then we should probably rethink how we structure our courses. Often, we teach in a linear, building block fashion. We spend weeks on the tiny details before we ever let students see why they matter. A Gestalt-inspired curriculum is often spiral or top-down. A top-down approach. Start with the big, messy, complex problem. Show them the whole first. For example, in a biology class, don't start with the molecular structure of a cell wall. Boring. Start with a complex ecosystem. Or start with a question: how does a marathon runner's body keep going for 26 miles? That is the whole. Now, to understand that, we need to look at energy. To understand energy, we need to look at glucose. To look at glucose, we need to look at the cell. By starting with the whole, the details, the parts, have context. The students know why they are learning about mitochondria. It's not just an arbitrary fact. It's a crucial piece of the puzzle they are already interested in. Interdisciplinary learning. Gestalt theory also supports getting rid of the rigid walls between subjects. Real life doesn't happen in 50-minute blocks of math and English. Real life is a mix. Project-based learning, PBL, is very Gestalt. If students are building a community garden, they are using math, measuring the beds, science, soil composition, English, writing a proposal to the principal, and social studies, understanding food deserts. They are learning in a holistic way. They are seeing how the subjects connect to form a coherent whole. Now, I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. Gestalt theory isn't perfect. Back in the day, the behaviorists criticized Gestalt psychology for being too vague. Concepts like insight and organization are hard to measure in a lab compared to number of times the rat pressed the lever, and they had a point. Some of the early Gestalt language was a bit mystical. Also, some critics argue that you can't always start with the whole. Sometimes, you really do need to memorize the parts first. You can't play a symphony, the whole, if you don't know how to play a C major scale, the part. There is a time and place for drill and practice, specifically when building automaticity and foundational skills. However, modern cognitive psychology has largely vindicated the Gestaltists. We now know a lot more about how the brain processes information, cognitive load theory, schema theory, and a lot of it lines up perfectly with what Wertheimer and his buddies were saying 100 years ago. Constructivism, the dominant theory in education today, is practically the grandchild of Gestalt theory. The idea that learners actively construct meaning? That's Gestalt. The idea that prior knowledge influences how we learn new things? That's Gestalt. So, what is the takeaway for the exhausted teacher grading papers on a Sunday night? Why does a bunch of German theory from the 1920s matter? It matters because it reminds us that our students are not hard drives. They are pattern seekers. They are meaning makers. Gestalt theory challenges us to look at our teaching from a higher altitude. It asks us to step back and ask, am I presenting this information as a random pile of facts, or am I showing the structure? Am I giving my students the chance to have their own aha moments, or am I stealing that joy by telling them the answer too soon? Is my classroom environment, the physical space and the emotional vibe, helping them focus on what matters? Am I teaching the whole child, or just training a test-taking behavior? When we embrace the Gestalt perspective, we stop seeing education as an assembly line. We start seeing it as an art form. We start helping students connect the dots, fill in the gaps, and see the beautiful, complex picture of the world. It boils down to this. We want our students to leave our classrooms not just with a bag full of parts, but with a deep, durable understanding of the whole. And that, in my book, is what education is all about. So next time you are planning a lesson, think about the face and the vase. Think about the continuity of your lecture. Think about the proximity of your notes. And most of all, leave a little room for insight. You might be surprised at what your students can figure out if you just give them the right vantage point.